Okay, we've got our quorum, and so, Madam Secretary, Flora, do you want to come up here? I know you've got two folks at least listed to be part of your team, Chuck Boyd and Andrew Wilson. Is that correct? And anybody else you want to bring up?
Yes, thank you.
And the topic of today is the briefing on planning and growth management. So not a small topic, an important topic. And Secretary Flora, the floor is yours, and take the time you need. Okay. Will the other folks be speaking, or they're just here for questions?
Primarily here for questions. We'll try to move things along.
And also, we're streaming. Could you bring that mic closer? Because now we stream and now we caption and everything. Yeah, much better. Thank you.
Okay, we're good to roll. Good afternoon, everyone. It's so good to see you, and Chair Feldman and Vice Chair Kagan. It's great to be back here, and happy to share with you one of our exciting areas, which is sustainable growth and comprehensive plans. So you all had 3 questions you asked us, and we're going to give you a quick briefing in response to those 3 questions. And so I'm going to take the lead and run you through a presentation we have put together. And then we have others here I'm going to introduce. And then for the record, I am Rebecca Flora, Secretary, Maryland Department of Planning.
Before we start, Vice Chair Kagan.
Before you start, Madam Secretary, and we're delighted that you're here. For anyone watching at home who's not aware, sustainable growth is now the new term of art for smart growth, which people would be aware of, correct?
Correct.
Just so people can follow along and know what you're talking about.
Thank you for that opportunity, and we will get into a definition of that in the presentation. Thank you. Sorry, I was just trying to be efficient with everyone's time. We'll just keep rolling. So yes, for the record, Secretary Rebecca Flora of the Maryland Department of Planning, and let my 2 colleagues introduce themselves for the record also.
This is Chuck Boyd from the Maryland Department of Planning, Assistant Secretary for Planning Services.
And I'm Andrew Wilson, Government Affairs Specialist from the Maryland Department of Planning.
Great. So with that, I'm going to walk you through a response to the 3 questions that we were asked. And we'll bring you through the presentation. I'll move fairly quickly. And then, like I said, we do have my colleagues here if you have any questions specific to what we're presenting here today. So let me just kind of get started. These were the 3 items that we were asked to respond to, which we'll walk through in each stage of the presentation, both the overview of the comprehensive planning process, evolution of the state's growth policy, and the shift from smart to sustainable. First, the comprehensive planning process. The first thing I want to flag is that we're going to move quickly through this, but we have an extensive web page on our Maryland Department of Planning internet site that goes into detail beyond what you may want to be interested in, but we do use that as a way of helping to work with the local planning officials, and that is the space where everyone goes to as it relates to comprehensive planning, and I have the link in here. The next thing, first and foremost, comprehensive planning as a planner, I am a credentialed planner, starts with the community. Comprehensive planning is all about the community's vision, and that's where it all begins. These are the core values that are really fundamental to the comprehensive planning process for communities, because it is very community-centric. I'm not going to read the slides. I'm just going to give you the highlights. The other really important thing to be aware of is that it is really the local planning commission's responsibility. This is their primary responsibility as a planning commission. And these are our volunteer planners, as we call them. We host training for all of those planning commissioners on a regular basis, and we're very grateful for the volunteer time that planning commission members put into this responsibility that they have that's fundamental within communities. The other key thing that I wanted to highlight is that by statute, there is a requirement around local review, adoption, and updates. Those are all in the statute, and we assist the local entities and jurisdictions with that process and are part of it as it goes along, which I'll share with you in a next moment. Keep in mind, which you're probably all well aware of, but everything that's a state requirement is actually legislative. And so it's our job to assist, quite frankly, the local jurisdictions with navigating all of these legislative requirements that are in code. And I've just simply put a link to all of these. Obviously, Chuck in particular, our Assistant Secretary of Planning, has lived this his entire career and is probably my best authority on any aspects of the code, in particular any of these areas that we work to try to help with the implementation of. The next thing are what you'll hear often are the elements of the comprehensive plan. These elements, and I have 2 slides that just list them, these are items that must appear in a comprehensive plan, but how they appear is totally up to the local jurisdiction. These are just things that we check for, that they're in the plan as per statute requirement. And so this is an initial list of those on the slide. And then this is the rest of that list. Keeping in mind fisheries, for example, has special requirements. It's only relevant to those areas that would be involved with those. And then there was a housing element added and then amended recently. But these are the requirements that just simply need to be in the comprehensive plan. How they are addressed is up to the local jurisdictions. The other thing is that the local jurisdictions can address, these are considered optional elements, and it's up to them as to whether or not they include those in their comprehensive plan. They are simply ones that are advised and suggested, but they're optional as to whether or not they're included. That's sort of a real compressed summary of the local side of the equation. Let me talk to the state technical side of the equation. We do take the lead as the Maryland Department of Planning with providing technical assistance and coordinating with our other sister agencies. Those agencies are primarily DHCD, DNR, MDE, and MDOT. Those are the ones that we coordinate with, and as you can see, based on these topic areas, each are assigned as the lead, and we do most of the coordination along with population projections and ensuring that the growth elements are in the plan and act as that coordinating entity in terms of the technical assistance that is available at the state to assist locals with their comprehensive plan and then of the review of that. The other part of this, in terms of one of our coordinating roles, is not only in terms of the assistance area, but there is a requirement that we must review the plan, and then to assist the planning commissioners in terms of addressing any comments. The one aspect of this process, which I'm in discussions with both my staff and planning directors, is that it's evident that that review comes too late in the process. You know, we need to really be engaged earlier in the process, but that's where it sits as per statute. So that is something we're reaching out and talking to planning departments and directors about. Is there a way we could improve upon that? But this is how it currently stands in terms of that review. Keeping in mind, our review is recommendations only. We don't have authority to actually change those local plans. We can only provide suggestions, and in some cases, they're well received, is very helpful, as something that they may not have had the capacity on the ground to think of or provide. The other area to be aware of is on that website that I showed at the beginning. There is a repository of all local plans as they are provided to us. And so that is part of our role also, is to maintain that repository of the plans. That can be really helpful because other various jurisdictions can look at what others are doing and hopefully find best practices and examples and models to be looking at, not to mention that we have a comprehensive place where all plans can be found. And then finally, just providing the annual report that comes to you all every year. We compile the data that we receive from all of the jurisdictions to pull together a report that comes to you every year, and that's one of our responsibilities at the Department of Planning. Finally, I just wanted to share before I leave this section of the one of the questions you asked, is that we are really from the get-go have been looking at restructuring the agency. We've been doing several things to really look at issues that have been raised through some of our roundtable meetings in terms of the timeframes to develop and approve, the capacity that varies so greatly amongst jurisdictions, the scaling, a really small community comparative to a very large county, for instance. But yet the statute is the same in all instances. So we're sort of looking at, is there creative ways? We're looking at best practices across the country to figure out, are there things that we can be doing to update our processes to make them more efficient and more effective? And then, of course, you're hearing more and more about every topic seems to need its own plan these days. We would rather that these plans be more comprehensive as they're intended, which is one of the things you'll see with us adding equity and resiliency, for instance, to the principles that we're going to be presenting. We've restructured also internally to try to help really expand access to best practices so that we can really be the agency that helps lead by providing tools, models, methods that can be helpful to local jurisdictions. So that is in response to what was your second question, or yes, the first question. I'm going to go into the second segment, which is the evolution of Maryland's growth policy, but perhaps Chair Feldman, would you like me to just keep rolling or stop at each segment for questions?
You know, if there are questions, any questions on this first section, we can take them now. Otherwise, I would just say roll on. Okay. Okay. Well, we have a question from Senator Washington.
Thank you. I think it was I think it was 3 slides back where we were talking about sort of what your tasks are. Could you just slide back for a minute? One more. Yeah, okay. Yes. So in terms of technical assistance, right? So in each of these areas, your agency provides technical assistance. What does that consist of? I guess, what does that mean?
Senator, it really does vary depending on the jurisdiction and the level of capacity on the ground. Sometimes there's a lot more hand-holding than there are in other areas. Other areas like employment and population projections, it's a data point that we can provide, and that's something obviously our state data center has access to. In other areas, there may be more technical type support needed because some of these things get pretty technical and they may not have the capacity on the ground to help
I guess
them.
in particular, just because you know, we're hearing some bills later on in this area, you know, when it looks at the preparation of water resource elements and or sensitive areas, what does that mean?
Okay, on that one, I'm going to punt over to our Assistant Secretary to maybe give you a little bit of a sense of what that might look like, and that is obviously MDE that we coordinate with on that one.
Senator Washington, for example, the water resource element, in fact, we've just done a few years ago, worked very closely with MDE to do a full rewrite of that and to bring in a lot of the most recent legislative changes into that process. So often our department, while we do have some subject matter experts, we really do look at MDE or DNR. In the case of sensitive areas element, that's a DNR-led element along the way. So we look to those subject matter experts in these different state agencies, and our job is often to work with the locals to figure out what is the issue, what is the question, what is the research thing that you need done, and then work with our partners or other state agencies to try to get as much information to them as possible.
Okay, just to clarify, so the technical assistance is provided to the locals to support compliance or, you know, to existing laws or?
Well, sometimes it may be an investigation of an issue at the local level so that they can then develop policies or programs at the local level. So often we provide data or we provide best practices along the way on how to address an issue. And then at the local level, they are the ones that are going to put it into their practice in their plan and into any implementation thereof.
Thank you. And I just have one more. You're going to cover mapping because you're a repository of data, and all, so is that coming later in the presentation?
Not mapping specifically. It really is under that first category.
Okay, so are you the repository of all, like, you know, of the maps or, you know, of our water resources, of, you know, streams, of roads? Like, where would we find that, or are you that?
Massive amount of information. One of our bills actually refers to the need for us to get it directly sometimes information, but I'll let Chuck respond to that in terms of, there's just so much to dig in there. We might need to do a follow-up with you on that.
Fine. Right. That's fine.
Because there's such a huge
that's
database and inventory.
Yeah, the short answer is we do some of the mapping, but all the other state agencies have their own responsibility in certain mapping areas and that it's all brought under DO-IT's IMAP. So there is a repository in DO-IT to maintain all of those statewide mapping efforts.
Okay, thank you.
We'll be happy to follow up with you,
Okay,
Senator.
any other questions before we move to this next section? Okay, seeing none. Okay, Secretary Flora, why don't you move on to the next?
Okay, the next segment was about the evolution of Maryland's growth policy. This is quite fascinating for me as a planner. And like I said, Chuck is my repository of knowing, really all-knowing of all of this land use law in the state of Maryland. But for the purposes of the group and for anyone out there in the public, you know, we're really referring to these particular sections of the code as it relates to growth policy. Those are the sections that are referred to under the land use and then under the state finance and procurement, primarily, of course, land use. And I don't know if you all have this in front of you, right? We put this together, this slide, and it's a very abbreviated version. We have the direct links to each of the acts in each case of how this has specifically evolved, starting back in 1992, in the Planning Act of 1992. At that point in time, there were 7 so-called visions back then, very much focused on conservation. That was really the initial focus around preservation of land, conservation of our natural resources, and that's where a lot of this started. It also was the early day of the smart growth movement around that particular focus topic area. In 2000, there was an 8th item added, which was the adequate public facilities, was added as to that particular, that was an amendment. And then, fast forward to 2009, there was actually a whole redo, so to speak, and that there were 12 visions that are on the books right now that are, in fact, the ones that are referred to in code as it relates to growth policy. What we're proposing, and you'll hear about in a bit, is the bill that we've proposed to do 15 years later, another amendment to update, make it more relevant, more focused, and create clarity, which we'll talk about that more in a bit. But if you really kind of trace this, we're talking, you know, quite a long period of time that this has evolved over time, and it's kind of time again for an update. So a lot more dug in under there. I think the big thing there is success. As it was originally intended and as it had been written and evolved over the years, very focused on preservation areas. And so, as you can see, that focus around smart growth was on where we develop, and that was the primary metric. And as you can see, we have preserved a lot of acres through that metric, and the Maryland Protected Lands Dashboard that we do in conjunction with DNR is the one that has tracked that over time, and that's where we've been so far. So that was just a quick snapshot of where we've come, what the focus has been, and my next segment in response to your all's question is the shift from smart to sustainable. So I will take another pause here at this point, Chair and Vice Chair, to see if questions on the evolution.
Okay, we have any questions on this section? Okay, Vice Chair Kagan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I thank you again. This is just really important work. I'm wondering how this administration is trying to navigate the balance between preservation of open space, joy of the environment and parks and all that, with economic development, because the governor talks about growth and jobs and bringing businesses and nonprofits to Maryland and all that for part of how we are going to flourish into the future. What does that tension look like, and how are those decisions made? And that also refers back, and we have another PowerPoint without page numbers, so I think I'm going to ask for page numbers. So the page that talks about the comprehensive plan, and you referenced that you advise local governments, and obviously they have autonomy to make their own decisions. But again, there's a struggle, I would think, between keeping the big picture and yet the granular focus on this particular parcel, which we want to reserve and develop or preserve and not develop or something. So if you can give us any idea of any of that.
Yes, and thank you. You've actually perfectly teed up the next segment.
Sorry. Thank you.
And I think of it as a balance. I mean, and that's what sustainability is. It's really a balance of those core principles of the economy and human needs and economic needs, and that's really very much a part of why we are evolving at this point in time from SMART that was very focused on the where and the preservation to sustainability and the 3 pillars of sustainability and trying to ensure that that's balanced. And so perhaps if I could, I
Yeah,
will
well, now
roll
that
into that
now
segment.
that she has teed it up for you, you can go to that section.
That's what I think, and then we'll see if you have more questions. I would love
Sorry
to
for
talk to
being
you
ahead,
more
yeah.
about it. No, this is good. It's perfect. So, whoops, I went the wrong way on that. Okay, here we go. So, starts with defining. I mean, one of the aspects of what is sustainable growth? What does that look like in the state of Maryland, and how does it relate to land use policy? And so we've put together a working definition of what that means, because, you know, I think as we think about land use and development practices, equitably considering that economic, social, and environmental implications, not only now, but in future generations. And so that's the whole intent of a sustainable growth policy versus a smart growth policy that would have been just focused on where we are developing. The overall goal, the vision, is thriving communities. By balancing all of those really primary needs, we are really aspiring towards what everyone wants, which is a community that thrives. And that's sort of that North Star, so to speak, of are we keeping these things in balance in a way that a community can thrive? And that really is the fundamental platform we are putting forth this amendment, actually, to the growth principles. So let me use that and then step forward with basically some of the things I've already said. You know, we're moving from where we grow to now the implications of how we grow. What does that look like? And then who's benefiting and impacted? So just bringing in those other parameters of sustainability into how we think about growth policy. The items over to the right are really expanding, which was only a simple metric of how much land is preserved, to now using metrics that really think about these core other fundamental issues of, are we improving human well-being? Are we mitigating climate change? Are we helping to grow the economy? And what are the indicators for that? And we are actually in the process right now, separate from the legislation, we have a whole team, a multi-agency team, that's putting together what those indicators should be. And really having a better way of really a tool, really, not a legislative item, but and not a regulatory, but more of a tool for locals to really understand what does that look like and applying it to their areas. The next thing is in terms of this shift and sustainable growth, you know, what we're basically updating and giving you the preview of the bill you'll be hearing is 3 key things. Moving from what were called visions to planning principles. In the field of planning and growth, you know, focusing on not vague vision statements, but really very specifically, what are the core planning principles that we should be abiding to? So just making that name change, adapting the current vision statements that are on the books, consolidating them, reframing, filling gaps, and adding equity and resiliency that wasn't there before, but trying to make them actually more simple, and you'll hear more about that in a minute. And then what are those priority topics that we're facing in Maryland, and you'll see the 8 that we're going to be presenting as part of how we're framing sustainable growth. The other thing is, why do we feel the need to go from smart to sustainable growth? We've mentioned that earlier in terms of sort of incorporating this balance of sustainability, but then also in terms of why is that needed in the statute? What we've heard in our outreach is that currently right now the visions as they're stated in the code are actually pretty vague and nobody kind of is a little unsure what to do with them. We're trying to create something that can be more relevant, improve clarity, create better alignment across all the things that we ask for at the state, and then simplifying the system overall. And that's a lot of why we feel this need and this shift. We've engaged, basically, we did 6 planner roundtables around the state, engaging about 150 people, give or take, around the state through these roundtables, talking to them, understanding, do you use these visions as they're stated? What's happening with the comprehensive plan elements? Do they work for you? Is this overly complicated? We're asking for this here and that here and this over here. And the answer to all of the above is yes. Anything you can do to simplify our lives, and that's kind of where we're trying to take this. So we've, you know, presented at our public forum that we do for the Sustainable Growth Subcabinet at MACO in August. We also did that again in December. We are using our Sustainable Growth Subcabinet as a sounding board board also as a multi-agency sounding board to basically develop and evolve where we're headed with what we're proposing. So the big question is always, how's that going to affect local planning? Really, not a lot. We're replacing visions with principles. We're doing less, and we're making them much more specific and clarified. Basically, as plans are updated, which are required every 10 years, or at least to be reviewed every 10 years, they would essentially be able to utilize these cleaner, simpler approach, and then essentially improve that alignment and the overall simplification, which everybody we've spoken to has said, sounds great. Anything you do to make our life simpler. So those are some of the ways. I mean, there's really, in some respects, there's no change. It's just simply putting something in place that would be, we think, cleaner, crisper, and easier to deal with. And everything that we've received so far is telling us we're on the right track. The final thing I wanted to share is, in fact, these 8. And so these 8 principles are, in fact, getting back to your question, Vice Chair Kagan, is that this is the balance, where in the past you may have seen more of that focus, not to say we're missing ecology, but more of a focus just on that one element of sustainability. Now we're sort of looking at this wheel and how these things are interconnected to really think about what does sustainable growth look like. The other thing I should share with everyone is that we did do a crosswalk of all of the existing visions and ensuring that we weren't missing anything that was important to folks with how we've tried to clean this up and make it easier through these 8 very core principles. So I wanted to share that also. And then finally, when we get back to this notion, well, what is sustainable growth? How does it relate to the governor's, our need to grow the economy? And this is how we would define it as it relates to land use. And that area that Maryland Department of Planning is most focused on is this balance about thinking about how we use our land, the transportation implications, housing, economy. And each of these statements are the very clean. I challenged ourselves to stick to 2 lines only to make it very clear and very obvious in terms of what each of these principles is about. And then here's the other 4 around equity, resilience. Those are the 2 new areas, and then place and ecology as the 8 simple principles that we would be moving forward with. So I move fast. I want to get through everything for you all, but hopefully, and then we can answer questions specifically about what is sustainable growth and why are we making this move. So we're here for that before we go into, you go into your hearing.
Right, so we're going to, when we're done, we're going to immediately transition to the 3 bills referenced here. So since you're here and you're the witnesses, we're going to keep you up at the table. But before we get to the 3 bills, specifically, any questions? We've got Senator Watson.
Thank you. Good to see you, Madam Secretary. Quick, easy question. In my district, I hear words so often. I just like to hear your definition of sprawl.
Boy, that's an interesting one, and it can be defined in a lot of different ways. But I think sprawl, from my perspective, and is that when we develop in an inefficient manner, think about, roads, different infrastructure, housing, it's all kind of just unfolding in an efficient manner versus trying to be more efficient about how much we build and where we build. I think it can also be defined as essentially, the use of land in terms of on a per acre, let's use acre for a minute, is how are we highly optimizing, utilizing land per acre? Are we using land in the best, most productive way possible? Now, I know I grew up in a rural area. I live in Chestertown, and I know we have people who love that. And we also have people that are in more urban areas. I believe that on a transect basis, we can have both, but we have to be efficient in how we develop, and particularly how we put funds into public infrastructure and how that works. So there's a broader implications. But for me, it's about really, I think, developing and growing in a very inefficient manner, and that it's basically not very resource efficient.
Right. So I've kind of heard that explanation before, but it's hard to codify into a plan, especially when in many parts of the state, when it comes to development, the developer is responsible for providing the road improvements and enhancements as a part of the approval from the local jurisdiction. And it all has to kind of work together. It's like a chicken and an egg type of thing. You know, you have to submit a plan and how you're going to mitigate all of these things that ultimately has to be approved. And so when we're talking about sprawl, I've heard it that, well, you want to build a new development over there, but there's no, say, water main that goes out there. So there's significant infrastructure that has to go into place first. And, you know, just looking at the fire situation on the West Coast, I mean, God forbid we build an environment where, you know, fire and safety can't get to water if they need it. So things just have to burn while they stand there and watch, which has happened, you know, out in Accokeek, you know, in Prince George's County. So I was just curious about that. I know our county council is struggling with what sustainable growth is. How do we build the economic engine we want without usurping all of the free agricultural land and preserving forest and trees, and there's this fine dance that we have to do to get to where we need to be. So, you know, any additional insight, you know, into that as we go along, if you see some kind of best practices from the different counties, you know, as they, you know, implement growth and those types of things, I'd love to hear it from you.
Yeah, and we'd love to follow up with you more on that. I would also say, as we all know, one size does not fit all.
That's
Our
right,
counties are
that's
so diverse, our state is so diverse, which makes it so wonderful, both in terms of geographies and metropolitan
Thank you.
and rural
Thank you very
areas.
much. Appreciate
Yes,
it.
thank you.
Okay, any additional questions for Secretary or her team before we move to the three bills that are departmental bills from you all? Okay, seeing none, that concludes the briefing part of our presentation. Do we have to take a 5-minute break? Okay, before we transition to the three bills, we need to take a 5-minute break for technical purposes. And so relax for 5 minutes.